Welcome to this episode of the Good Leadership Podcast. We explore the stories, strategies, and insights of thought leaders who inspire us to think differently and lead better. For this episode, I'm once again thrilled to be joined by two of the most influential figures in learning and memory science, Dr. Robert and Elizabeth Bjork. Their pioneering research on topics such as desirable difficulties, metacognition, and forgetting have transformed our understanding of how people actually learn versus how they believe they learn. Today's episode is the second half of my conversation with them, where we dive even deeper into the science of learning and memory. Building on their groundbreaking research, we explore how these research-backed, proven learning techniques can be applied in real-world settings. I hope you enjoy. Welcome to the Good Leadership Podcast, where we explore the stories, strategies, and insights of thought leaders who inspire us to think differently and lead better. Through candid conversations and expert perspectives, we dive into the challenges, breakthroughs, and practical lessons that shape exceptional leadership. Talk to me a little bit more about, because we get a lot of professional learners wanting to read stuff, and they're rereading, they're highlighting, they're underlining. Whereas, like you said, Elizabeth, close the book and try to retrieve the information from the chapter, or generate your own summary. Because generating an answer, even when you get it wrong, creates a much deeper memory than just recognizing it or being shown it as you're reading a book.
Well, if nothing else, it makes you realize, I thought I knew this, but I don't, in the sense that I can't just do this on my own without looking at the book. So it kind of can direct your learning and study in a more effective way because okay, I seem to be able to answer questions about when I apply this kind of a formula to solve the problem, no matter how long I wait. But I'm really fuzzy on this other formula. So it can direct your studying to the total body that you need to learn. You can learn, I've got A and B pretty well, but I'm really slippery on C and D, those segments. So it can help you that way. But we get questions like this a lot from teachers, and we always feel bad that we can't say, okay, if you're teaching geometry, you need to, have this kind of a spacing. If you're teaching like a literature course and you want people to remember the various, acts that were important, that were passed and how they changed society and so forth, you need to use these kind of spacings. We wish we had that kind of body of knowledge. We sometimes think there ought to be some central place where teachers of geometry, teachers of history, teachers of English can go and see if you're teaching for this kind of material you're trying to get your students to learn, you need to use this kind of spacing. But then, of course, it also depends on the students, what they already know. So how to get to that optimal spacing is for different subjects, whether it's, learning motor movements or learning algebra or whatever you're trying to learn is tough. And we haven't ourselves come up with how to advise people except through trial and error.
And you're right. I think that's the best method for most people, especially adult learners that are self-taught, that want to improve their development. It's just trying out at different intervals. If you've gone too far, you might have forgotten too much, and relearning is going to happen. If you haven't gone far enough and it's too easy, then kind of gauge that. It's an individual metric that they have to learn for themselves. But most importantly, it's to know that spacing out effect, you need to let some forgetting happen. And you talk
Right.
about goal-directed forgetting, which is a fascinating idea. How does actively letting go of outdated knowledge work, and what are some practical tactics to do so?
We're confronted with that all the time, and it seems like the rate at which now that procedures, what are methods and whatever change, that we've learned something and now all of a sudden it's outdated and needs to be done some other way. This poses none of these dynamics are new. It's just that things change more rapidly now, where something that was critical in your business, now the company gets rid of that software and there's a whole new software system. And that's happening probably right now with the artificial intelligence. This is more turmoil than maybe ever before right now, right at this moment, about what will a computer do faster than people will do, how to share your knowledge and so on. And it poses unique challenges. I can't help but think back all the way to when the second year of grad school at Stanford, they had at that time these so-called comprehensive exams, which you would go exams in all these major areas of psychology. And without realizing how super effective it was, there were 4 of us as grad students that had become friends from playing basketball together, who were each in different areas of the psychology, the developmental, clinical, cognitive. And we decided they had all the old comprehensive exams on the file. So you could get those and practice answering those old questions. And it turned out that we had a system where you just had to try to answer this next question, whether it was in your area or not. And that turned out to be so effective. We didn't understand at the time why, but that kind of process of cooperative learning embedded with the challenges of interacting, correcting, producing.
And you're right, that is so effective. And I love, and it's because I haven't seen this elsewhere in the learning science research, but that goal-directed forgetting is about freeing up cognitive resources to focus on what is relevant now. Because like what both of you say, without forgetting, old habits and knowledge compete or undermine you learning new skills.
Yeah, people think that's very strange, but I mean, goal-directed, for example, let's just say that a friend in high school or maybe college that you've gotten to know by their maiden name gets married and now adopts the married name. Well, that's illustrative of a challenge we confront a great deal. And now in social and other environments, it can be inappropriate to introduce her by her earlier name. But those things are in competition. And one thing that makes it particularly challenging is the longer the retention interval till you have to recall somebody's name or something, the more the earlier name will become prominent. This gets into theoretical dynamics. We don't really have time here, but very powerful effect that if I learned a person's name and now they have a new married name, I may as pretty quickly get to where I can recall their married name reliably. But if we go off somewhere and come back for some reunion event, the name that will be most dominant will be their earlier maiden name. This is just a fundamental access will shift preferentially to the earlier things learned. At a short interval, it will be the later things, but as it gets longer, it's the earlier learnings.
In training pilots, this is a real problem because if you train them on one particular plane and they've now sufficiently mastered all the ways that you have to lower this flap and so forth, and then they're on a new plane now, which is very similar but not identical. If there's any kind of an emergency or something like that, they will tend to go back to the earlier learned things. So if the flap you need to raise if the toggle for that used to be on the right, but now it's on the left, you will tend to immediately go to the right. And it takes a long time of training them in the new situation to make those earlier learned responses less available.
If it's not a crisis, it's routine, you may be fine producing the current motor activity. But if in crisis, there tends to be, again, a process of kind of reverting to earlier learning. And there's plenty of examples over the years with automobiles where the emergency brake has been, all over the place if you think about it. And some of those, you've got a new car and now it's a different procedure in a real crisis with the car brakes failing. In many cases, people can be trying to find this brake handle where it's not fitting.
That, once again, is somewhat counterintuitive that over a longer period of time, the information that they first learned really predominates. But in the short period of time, you can overcome that bias, if you want to call it a bias, so that it's current. But long term, you really look at that primacy effect of where they first learned it and how they learned it. Well, let's talk about technology because you kind of touched upon it What advice would you give for using technology to support rather than undermine effective learning? Because AI is great. I've used AI to incorporate everything we've said so far: retrieval practice, interleaving, spacing out effect, but it can also think for you. And I think people are inherently lazy. The brain is a lazy organ. It wants to
Hmm.
automate as much as possible. It doesn't like this idea of desirable difficulties and really thinking more. But how can we leverage technology to really use the best of learning science to get us to learn faster and more effective?
Boy, it's hard to think of a question that is more timely or actually more difficult.
One easy example, one of the things we hear from teachers a lot, it takes so much time to write good questions. I mean, multiple choice questions are very pervasive in education, in part because they're not that difficult to write and um, they're easy to grade. So if you have 100 students, 200 students in your class, which is typical of a lot of big universities, it would be impossible to grade 200 essay answers. But with multiple choice, you can do it okay. But for those multiple choices to be effective for learning, you have to write them in such a way that they force the student to think when they're answering the question. So you don't want the alternatives to just be so ridiculous that they don't even have to look at them. So you have to make what we call competitive multiple choice tests. And this is hard, meaning all the alternatives are plausible. There's no ridiculous, they can just reject out of hand. They have to read and consider each alternative. And in doing that, they actually learn not only the answer to the correct answer, but they learn information relevant to all these other alternatives. Oh, this kind of B sort of looks right, but I remember that. And they come up with why B can't be true. Teachers are convinced that when they have to use multiple choice questions because of the number of people they're teaching, they know that they're not very effective compared to retrieval or an essay kind of questions. But this kind of gives them a way to have the benefits of multiple choice testing, but also improve the students' learning of things that are related, but were not actually specifically tested. So it seems like that would be a place that AI could help. Is
Definitely.
But at the same time, it's just causing turmoil because you give an assignment as a teacher, and what you could get back as answers to essay questions was what that student found. Could have AI help them. And so that's right now really, it's very interesting, but teachers are trying to come up with different dynamics, how you can actually use some of these things. And maybe the task is to criticize the answer that's online. What was good about it and what was not mentioned. So you're not to parroting something as an answer, you are critiquing it. So the machinery, so to speak, exists. If you give essays exam, you can identify pretty well as a teacher where a
You're right.
student's answer has just been copied.
Agree with you. I mean, and I taught in higher education for many years as well, and experienced the same things. AI was just coming into its full effect then. I find with professional learners and leaders, we live in an information age. We're inundated by information. So perhaps maybe another application is using AI technology to curate it. Not to save you from learning it, but to curate it down to its essential pieces and to take research articles, make them more understandable and applicable to them so they can use that knowledge and apply it right away versus trying to decipher something, or maybe they don't have the background to fully understand the implications.
I find myself with every sort of possible attitude about this particular time. I mean, we've been thinking about writing, but some of those things, I asked a question like, what did Robert and Elizabeth Bjork say about desirable difficulties? It came back with about 8 paragraphs that were shocking to us. We were thinking, could we have written this ourselves any better than this? So, I mean, people are finding examples where it's misleading or you can strive to confuse the system, but I'm not sure where it's all headed. It's going to change everything.
Well, I'd like to ask you two more questions before we end today. First one, is there a memorable finding from your lab or your research that surprised you or shifted your thinking?
Elizabeth, I can jump in here first because I have such a good memory of this. All the way back when I was a grad student at Stanford, and we were first starting to try to do kind of mathematical models, simple models of how people learning. And I had people doing a task. I won't go into the details of it, but in terms of just kind of fitting the responses, I found out that if something was presented again when it was in what I won't go into what all's meant by short-term memory, but it's presented again when it's still in your kind of short-term memory from right before. This best fitting model I was working on said there was zero learning. And later, then we did experiments that showed just that. You were no better if you gave present something once and presented it again. The long-term retention was no better than just once. So that second time did zero, not had small effects. It didn't do anything additional. And that, of course, led to many other experiments. But I think just then that led in lots of different ways to research projects we and others had carried out on terms of this relationship. I mean, there's a metacognitive side we've already talked about, but there's a practical side of optimizing education, and there's the metacognitive side of what choices people make to present themselves with something right away again. But it's kind of funny in a way if you think about that so much of this can be unintuitive. You know, I've sometimes told students in classes, they take notes as though there's some kind of recording device, like they have to get down every word. A good example we've used to say, forget that, is a court stenographer can get every word down from a whole day in court. And you could ask that person at the end of the day, what were the issues? What were the problems? And so on. They have no idea. The activity suppresses learning. It doesn't enhance that sort of copying. But I don't know what you might want to add to that, Elizabeth.
Well, I was just saying more recently, one of the things that kind of surprised us was how effective pretesting is for learning. And what I mean by that is, say you assigned a chapter that has to be read, and you ask students to answer certain questions about that chapter before they've read it, and you have to explain to them, why you're doing this. And I said, well, I just want to get a good idea of how much you know about the various things I'm going to be talking about already. And so they seemed it seemed reasonable for them to take this pretest about material that I had not talked about yet. And then later on at the final exam, I discovered that for the lectures that I had pretested in this way, students were better on 10 weeks later on an exam answering for lecture material that I had used pretesting on. Students were much better about answering those questions than on lectures that I didn't use pretesting. And not only that, but they were able to answer completely incorrect. So if they were just performing random on this pretesting, they still did better on questions that came from that lecture and that tested the same material that they were just guessing about at the beginning. So that, I think, has now been shown that you're going to be reading. It's also been shown in lectures, big lectures. Bob, can you think of other places where pretesting has?
Oh, not offhand, but it seems very broad. It's kind of like you have this feeling, well, I don't know the answer to this, but some words make you think, well, maybe it's related to the something, maybe it's this and that. And that process seems to set you up to make your learning more effective when it's actually covered in class.
Yeah.
So people instincts would be to think this is useful. Why would you be giving me, you haven't covered this stuff already. Why are you thinking you should test me? But
That's a good point.
But this is a very active domain of research right now. I mean, this is quite recent, some of these results.
One of our
And you're
students used it in conjunction with using the computer. If someone asks you a question, I think I know that, but I'll just Google. And so she had those questions. And then before you could, and everybody could Google, but you had some of the students, students, had to first try to answer the question from their own memories, without. And even if they couldn't do it or whatever, then she allowed them to Google. And then later, the students who had to think first before Googling did much better on an exam that tested all that material. And not only that, but they did better on related information to what they had. If they Googled, they just got the right answer, but they didn't activate all this related information that you might do if you were trying to think of the answer on your own.
That's a great insight because you're right. Priming, we use priming a lot within the programs, that pre-information, because all learning is connecting it to information you already know. And priming those connections has proven useful. And you're right, Robert, there's a lot more research on this recently and its impacts and effects in a wide variety of arenas. The final question, love to ask both of you, is what excites you most about the future of learning science? Either research area, technology, societal trend, and what do you hope the next generation of learners or teachers will accomplish?
Well, you know how to ask some tough questions. Some of these translates to what are those early years of learning are awfully important, even the kind of grade school years. And what is it involving AI or just the training of teachers and stuff can then make that activity lead to permanent learning of really important concepts and so on. Because it's at a time in a kid's life when all sorts of social dynamics are going on and insecure. But I just think if some of this research can go back and create a foundation, and there is some indication that if early school learning is optimized, it can make up a substantial part of the lack of learning on the part of some of your students because of what their home environment's like. And that, in some ways, when I think of things that we haven't been across our careers developmental psychologists, but that when you think that there is maybe the potential from students who've been in a home environment where maybe there aren't books and there's not encouragement and whatever, that leads to a kind of deficit when they start formal schooling. I think it's very exciting to think, is there some way to make up for that? Is there some way? And there are certain results that make it look like there might be some promising things to kind of bring those students, because some of these things can have larger effects if certain levels of learning have not already occurred. But anyway.
Well, maybe technology can help with that regard too,
Yes.
right? Where
Yeah.
I know Sal Khan at Khan Academy, he did Khan Amigo, which is that AI tutor that really helps students along and levels the playing field between those that have very advantageous backgrounds and home environments versus those that don't. Anything you want to add to that, Elizabeth, regarding anything that you're excited about or directions you hope learning science goes into?
I would really like for everybody to understand that making mistakes, just because you don't know the answer, doesn't mean you're stupid or you can't learn. Failing and then correcting those failures is a very effective way to learn. So we should look at failures not as failures, but as presenting opportunities for you to learn. And that sort of speaks to what Bob was saying. I think a lot of students are just kind of turned off. This is too hard for me. I can't do it. Actually, if you persist because it's hard, you will probably master that information much better than a student who isn't struggling with it at the beginning.
That's a great encouraging note to end our conversation on. Thank you so much, Dr. Robert and Elizabeth Bjork, for joining me today. Appreciate it so much. Remind our listeners, is there a way they can get in contact with you or learn more about your work?
Yeah, well, they can look up at almost any terms like desirable difficulties or whatever. People are welcome to contact us with specific questions they have.
Thank you again for joining me today, and thank all of you. Remember, the principles we've uncovered in advance, especially in the value of productive struggle, the critical role of retrieval, and the importance of accurate metacognition provide a powerful research-backed playbook for anyone committed to lifelong learning and development to follow. Thank all of you. And until next time, remember, it's not what you know, but what you do consistently that makes a difference. I hope this episode has provided you with valuable insights. If it has, I ask you to share it with someone who would also benefit from it. If you've been enjoying and gaining knowledge from this podcast, then subscribe to our YouTube channel where you can find all the previous episodes of the podcast and additional learning resources. You can also subscribe to the podcast on Apple or Spotify and leave up to a 5-star review.